I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome a delegation that has traveled far to join us. We are very pleased to have Kiyoshi Murakami and Professor Kamoshida from Iwate University here. I think they may get the prize for coming the farthest. Please take the opportunity to speak with them. They are representing Iwate University, which was in the region that was hit hardest by the Great Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And the university it supported the community recovery, and it engaged in an extraordinary way, in part due to the wonderful leadership of the university president, who was not able to join us. But his special advisor, Mr. Murakami, is here. So thank you all. Also, I would like to take the opportunity also to introduce Teresa Pardo, director of our Center of Technology and Government. Teresa has been performing the primary MC role and keeping things moving along. She is absolutely an extraordinary person who embodies in her work connecting government with the private sector and academia in the solving of important problems. She is an advisor to Governor Cuomo, the Open New York initiative, work with NASA, EPA, and we wouldn't have time for the panel if I continued to list her accomplishments. But let's give Teresa an applause. Take it away, Teresa.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here to participate with us in this very important panel. We're here tonight with an esteemed group of colleagues representing different aspects, different components of the U.S. federal government. And our goal with this armchair discussion is to explore some of the key strategies that the agencies that they participate that they're members of, that they lead, the key strategies that are being advanced by those agencies, and taking a closer look at the investments and the policy decisions very specifically that are building community resilience. So our approach tonight is going to be, we'll give each of our panelists, each of our guests, about 3 to 5 minutes to introduce themselves, to tell you a little bit about the work that they do. And then, as you would expect, we have a set of planned questions. And we'll very quickly move also to opening up the floor. You'll see there's a couple of microphones here. We'll have the opportunity, we hope, to open up the floor to engage in a dialogue with you before the evening is out. As you know from looking at the program, following this armchair discussion, there will also be a showing of an important film, and we'll get you to that opportunity as quickly as possible. What I'd like to do first is just give a quick introduction to each of the panelists, who will then introduce themselves as part of their remarks. So to my left, we have David Alexander. David serves as the Senior Science Advisor in the Office of Resilience at U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Joel, I had to look up, I suppose. Joel Shiraga is a Senior Advisor at the EPA for Climate Adaptation. To his left is Ellen McCrae. She is the Regional Climate Services Director for the Eastern Region for NOAA's National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service. And finally, on the far left is Maria Honeycutt. Maria serves as Assistant Director for the National Disaster Resilience at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage. So David, would you like to kick it off?
Sure. So good evening. So it's an honor and pleasure to be here. I want to thank Teresa, Vincent, Eric, as well as Bob Griffin I do have some previous existing relationship with Bob Griffin, as he was formerly at the DHS Science and Technology Directorate, where I reside now. Just a little bit of background about me before I make a few statements and some observations on the event today. So I am not a federal bureaucrat, even though I am a career federal service. And I say that in jest because I started my career at the local level. Actually, a third of my career was in the state and local level, a third in the private sector, and a third in the federal government. So I could say that within DC, we often say that DC is 50 square miles of insanity surrounded by reality. I would like to say that 2/3 of my career shows that I'm grounded in reality. So I will say, this event, besides it being an honor to be here just because of SUNY and the esteemed colleagues and you in the room, is that, in a lot of ways, this event is a complement to Homeland Security pivot that occurred a couple years ago. In 2016, then Secretary Nielsen revealed what she called her resilience agenda. And this was a long time coming and starting to transition the agency away from trying to respond our way out of disasters and starting to make sure that we're strengthening our communities going forward. And what she meant was that, it's not about recovery and rebuild and replace. It's about bouncing forward. And in a lot of ways, I think that exemplifies the American ethos. I think we've made leaps and bounds because we've always been forward-looking. We might have been grounded in the past, but we weren't dwelling in the past. We've always looked to the horizon. I think that's what the American dream is about, and that's why I think a lot of folks come to America. I think that's why we've been able to excel as a society, and it's a core tenet that we undervalue, that we're always looking forward and not looking towards the past. And I think that's an important aspect of resilience. In addition to her presenting her resilience agenda and putting it out in a state of Homeland Security in 2016, the department did start to take some actionable moves in terms of underpinning that statement. I think the first was in the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They went through some revisioning, and they established an Office of Resilience. I think that sets the tone. It wasn't just the same old FEMA. It was FEMA acknowledging that we don't want to just rebuild and replace. We want to strengthen our communities going forward. We want to address the big challenges that are facing America today. As a complement to that, and as a complement to its strategic agenda about building a prepared and ready nation and establishing a culture of preparedness, they also recognize that there are cultures of preparedness. And that meant that there's no one size fits all. You're not going to get one answer from Washington, D.C. That for us to be resilient as a nation, we have to ensure that the communities and the infrastructure, the systems, the organizations, and the citizens within those communities have ownership in how they achieve resilience. It wasn't going to be just a Washington top-down approach. And to put kind of some rubber meets the road, they started to establish some strategic objectives. One of those was to look at doubling the amount of insurance uptake. We all know that financial preparedness is an important aspect of resilience. They looked at financial preparedness not just as how much money do you have in your bank account and how many days or how much can you absorb, but also that you have some peace of mind. And that means that you obtain insurance. Now, they didn't just limit it to you obtain flood insurance. They looked at insurance as a mechanism, an instrument to not just support communities and public infrastructure, but also to support businesses and critical infrastructure. And this gets to a conversation around, financial preparedness can lead towards business continuity of operations. If we can reduce the disruptions to our infrastructure, in a lot of ways we can reduce the disruptions to our communities. And we can focus on the human element and less on the physical element of rebuild. And those are important perspectives. The second is that they put another moonshot goal out, which was to quadruple the amount of investment in mitigation, recognizing that insurance and mitigation goes hand in hand. You know, you can buy peace of mind, but if you want affordable peace of mind, you have to reduce that exposure. And that exposure cannot just be driven by the private sector. It also has to be driven by communities and citizens themselves. And that gets into, you know, that mitigation investment moonshot goal starting to drive a conversation around realigning incentives towards resilience. Incentives that would motivate individuals, incentives that would motivate organizations and businesses, as well as incentives that would motivate communities. So that's a long introduction and answer around, you know, what did I learn today? I think I learned a lot of good ideas and some conversation around how universities and scientists can come into the fold. One thing that I would like to see more of going forward is the fact that you recognize it's interdisciplinary. It's also about making sure that you connect with those that are on the front lines, those operators. If you want to push science to operations, you can't just be scientists in the room talking to scientists. You have to be scientists in the room talking to the operators.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much. I think the ideas of resilience, a community, and interdisciplinarity, I think, resonate with everyone here. Joel, can you give us your 3 to 5 minutes?
You bet. Thank you, Teresa. Good evening, everybody. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here as well. And I want to thank President Rodriguez for hosting this event and making it happen. So thank you. I'm here today to present an opportunity to all the universities here, which I'll lead up to in my presentation. But I want to start out with EPA's mission. Our mission at the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect public health and the environment. And we do that in partnership with states, tribes, and local communities all across the country. Now, over the last 30 years, we've learned that many of the outcomes that we collectively are trying to attain, such as protecting the quality of the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, having effective cleanup of Superfund sites and brownfield sites, all of those things are sensitive to weather extremes like hurricanes, as well as to changes in climate. And now with the climate changing at an increasingly rapid rate, it is imperative that working together, we anticipate and prepare for future climate change. So our goal at the Environmental Protection Agency is to empower all 40,000 communities across the United States to anticipate and prepare for climate change. And we do that through 3 mechanisms, traditionally or historically. The first is through training. We work with local government officials and provide them with training to increase their awareness for why the things that they care about on a day-to-day basis are affected by climate change and why they might care about climate change. The second is through the provision of tools, data, and information that they tell us that they need. And we produce things like EPA's Stormwater Calculator and its CREATE tool for water utilities. And the third is through the provision of financial resources, because as you've heard in many of your sessions, adaptation costs something, and it requires financial resources. So over the last 20, 30 years, we, along with our federal partners like at NOAA, have worked very hard to support those communities. The problem is that as we've evaluated how well we've done, we've identified the problem that most of those 40,000 communities are still struggling to adapt. Most of them are not the Chicagos or the San Franciscos or the Seattles that have a lot of experience and expertise and resources to deal with climate change. Most of those 40,000 communities are middle to smaller, underserved communities that lack the experience and the expertise and the resources to deal with climate adaptation. But even more informative to us was we heard from them, we're overwhelmed with all of the information that's out there on climate change impacts and adaptation. And they said a lot of it's not even relevant to the issues of concern to us where we live. In addition, when they could identify the relevant information, they were struggling to integrate it into a single recipe that they could help that they could use to understand soup to nuts why climate change matters for the things that they care about, what are the potential adaptation strategies, and then how to effectively implement those strategies in practice. Where am I heading with this? And again, I want to drive to the opportunity for the universities. In 2016, EPA launched its Climate Change Adaptation Resource Center, which we call the ARC-X for short, for local government officials. And what it does is it enables the users, the mayors, the county executives, to come to the system and self-identify, to tell us where they live, as well as what the issues of concern are to them. And once they do that, they are instantaneously provided an integrated package of information tailored specifically to their needs, again, to help them understand soup to nuts how to deal with climate impacts and adaptation. The proof is in the pudding. Within 3 months of launching it back in 2016, we already had 15,000 unique repeat users across all 50 states. Now, all of that sounds great, but now let me turn to the opportunity for universities, and I'll end. We recognized that what we had developed was a national system. The problem is we can't at EPA do the deep dive into any one particular state and all of its communities. So our standing offer to universities across the country is we will make available free of charge the code and the content of our ARC-X system, which the taxpayers have paid for, to a host university in any one state to develop a state-level version of the Adaptation Resource Center, and we'll provide the technical assistance to develop that state-level system. So it offers an opportunity for universities to become a repository of information relevant to their communities, and also a bridge to decision makers in their communities, and also a convener of dialogues with those decision makers. It also offers an opportunity for those universities to leverage and work with other universities and form networks with other universities within their states. And I'm excited to say that the University at Albany has accepted the challenge to develop an ARC-X system for New York State and another one for Puerto Rico. So let me, and again, President Rodriguez, I really want to commend you, Albany, for accepting that challenge. So let me leave you with the challenge, and I'll stop. Our goal, working with NCSC and Michelle Wyman over the next year, is to begin development of state-level versions of the ARC-X for all 50 states and Puerto Rico by the end of 2020. And we envision that we will then have a network of host universities linking all of these state-level versions and linking decision makers all across the country. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. Ellen.
Good evening, and thank you guys for staying with us. You have dinner, and we're going to try to get you before the lull happens. So have some of those desserts, okay, and coffee. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm NOAA's Regional Climate Service Director for the Eastern Region, which is really interesting because I started this about 10 years ago, and I remember saying to my boss, "What am I supposed to do about this?" And she's like, "You'll figure it out." She's like, "We have a huge ecosystem of people that we work with in NOAA. You just have to sort it all out." And I was like, this is a huge and compelling problem that all of us have been facing. We know that the trends are such that the precipitation is not raining the way it used to. Okay, it just doesn't rain the way it used to, right? You don't get those gentle rains. You get nothing, 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 whoosh, you know? So it just doesn't rain like that. You also know that the temperatures are changing. We know that temperatures are rising. How do we deal with that in the public health arena? We saw this in some of the panels earlier today. Public health is facing tremendous challenges with increasing heat. You know, my own house, we made a decision not to use air conditioning. Okay, That was crazy as a climate scientist, right? So you have to think about what kinds of issues we're facing as communities, as regions, as local, state, federal, all different scales. And I'm here to tell you that NOAA has really thought about this, and it's why I moved from the science arena. I really want to pick up on that fact that I lived at local for a while. Then I moved down to Washington, then now I'm back at the local scale. And the reason is that that's where we make a difference. We all know that it really matters at the regional scale, that what we do at the national level is great in terms of setting up the organizational construct, but the boots on the ground are what make the difference. So all of you guys are what makes the difference. And NOAA has worked hard over decades to create these partnerships at the local scale to make that difference. And so I just want to highlight a few of the programs that we have that have set the foundation for the kind of service delivery and information services that NOAA provides. In part, we work across that, like I said, national, regional, state, local scales. We do that in the geographic sense, but we do that mainly through our partners at Sea Grant, and I just want to give a huge shout out to the folks that are here from Sea Grant, yeah, because you are the university partners. You guys are the ones that are on the ground. You are the ones making the local connections. You are the ones with the trusted partnerships. When somebody says, you know, how do I find out information from NOAA? The Sea Grant person is there going, call me. That's exactly what it's about. So beyond Sea Grant, though, we have the Office of Coastal Management, Maria's home office. Office of Coastal Management and the Ocean Service has been working on those close partnerships when it comes to coastal resilience for decades. It comes to working with coastal zone managers at the state level, working with the estuarine research reserves, and other places where we're making it matter about climate-ready estuaries, which is an EPA program. We work together on that. We also have the weather forecast offices. Most of you guys, when you think about NOAA, you might think about, you know, fisheries and regulation. You might think about coastal models and coastal oceans. But we have the Weather Service, okay? And the Weather Service has 122 forecast offices in every one of the states and more. Every office is surrounded by its own little radar dome. That's how they decide how many they're going to be, okay? But the weather forecast offices are the ones that get the call. So I sit in the weather forecast office for that reason, because when we get a call about life and property, it goes to the Weather Service. When we get a call about watches and warnings, it goes to the Weather Service. When we think about things that happen at the hours to days to weeks time scale, that's the Weather Service. But when you think out beyond weeks and into what we now call subseasonal to seasonal and out into the long decadal processes, that's where the climate services come in, which is also still part of NOAA. So we're pulling all of this together at different time scales, different geographic scales, and also in different topical scales. So we work with public health officials, we work with state transportation officials. Should we build that bridge? Should we build that bridge to a community that isn't going to be there because of sea level rise in a few years? It takes 30 years to think about building a bridge, so let's make sure we're making smart decisions now. So NOAA's information is brought to you by our folks on the ground, like Sea Grant, like the regional climate centers that we have at Cornell University. They're also brought to you by the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments teams. All of these are investments that NOAA makes with the universities currently. So when we think about setting up an ecosystem within RISE, make sure that we're examining all of what I call the entities that are already out there, the universities that already competed for federal dollars and are recognized local arms of our agencies that have those trusted relationships already. At the regional scale, we also have river forecast centers. We're in the midst of a huge multi-agency look at how water happens across all of the 48 continental states, Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii. How does it rain? And we are on top of it when it comes to our prediction of rain, especially thinking about Houston and the recent disasters. Our water models are now really coming into fruition where we can see the rain. Like, who would have thought we were going to get, you know, what did we get, 50 or 60 inches of rain in Houston? The models were showing us that, and it comes down to whether or not people believe it. So it comes back to the local relationships that we have to get people to understand that when the model says it, it probably is going to happen, and sure enough, it did. And it was really great that we had weather forecast offices on the ground to talk that through. So, when it came to having this job a few years ago, and I said I had no idea what I was going to do with this whole ecosystem, but I was just compelled to help. I think that's what I'm feeling here, is that you guys are compelled to help, and I'm really excited to bring you guys into this ecosystem that we have and be a part of being that boots on the ground. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And so our final introductory remarks, Maria?
And I will echo my colleagues. Thank you for sticking with us here at the end, and thank you to the president and the conveners of the conference. I'm really grateful. This is my first opportunity to represent my new office. As Ellen said, I'm on loan from NOAA to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'm really excited to share some of what we are doing in OSTP around this topic of resilience. Since coming on board in the beginning of 2019, Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer, who is the President's Science Advisor and our OSTP Office Director, came in with a set of priorities, 3 prime priorities: unleashing discovery and innovation, building the workforce of the future, and advancing America's global S&T leadership. Mom and apple pie, right? Let me show of hands. How many people before you heard this introduction had heard of OSTP? Ooh. That's more than I expected. I mean, I'm a native Washingtonian, and my family still doesn't understand what I do. So I'm so glad that so many of you have heard of OSTP. For those that aren't familiar, we essentially try to coordinate S&T policy across the federal government. No small exercise, given the examples of the folks up here. And the others that are not participating necessarily in this panel. We also work very closely with our peers in the Executive Office of the President, the Office of Management and Budget, you know, the people with the money, the Council on Environmental Quality, as well as the National Security Council and others, to develop policy. We are the scientific and engineering underpinning of a lot of these policies, and so we are a trusted partner with these colleagues. And so what I wanted to do is just very quickly highlight 3 ways, things that we're working on right now that are relevant to this resilience conversation. The first is that each year, OMB and OSTP, the directors, come together to issue a fiscal year R&D budget priorities memorandum, and it is meant for the federal agencies to use to guide as they are developing their budget packages and in that fun negotiation that goes back and forth. And so in the FY21 memorandum, which just came out in August, so that's for the fiscal year starting next fall, there is one of the 5 priorities is American security. And I will tell you, one of the first dimensions that's listed is critical infrastructure resilience. Departments and agencies should invest in critical infrastructure R&D that improves resilience to natural disasters and physical threats, and goes on to elaborate. So that right there is that ever important budget and policy hook to say the kinds of things that we are discussing here are important. Now, one might say it's critical infrastructure. What about the rest? And I would say yes. So let's see what we can get into the next memorandum, and that's what I see as part of my role, is to bring that back to have a fuller picture. The second dimension is we are working with the National Security Council's Resilience Directorate. They have an entire group focused on resilience, and they're trying to develop some strategies and policies around building the nation's resilience to quite an array of disruptions. I think we immediately think of natural hazards and adversarial threats, things that go boom, as part of what we're concerned about. But I have been very impressed with my NSC colleagues and the broad look at the other disruptions, whether they be economic, whether they be health, other social constraints and issues that we need to build resilience to. And so I have been very impressed with that thoughtfulness. I'm not in a position where I can say very much because we're waiting for some of their strategies to come out, but I will say I would expect there to be dimensions that would resonate with many in the room. Asking questions like, what can we do to help our communities anticipate, adapt to, withstand, and not just recover, but evolve in the face of disruption, to come back stronger and more prosperous in the face of disruption. And so I'm very excited to be bringing some of the S&T to help support those types of policies. And the third thing I wanted to mention is something that takes up a lot of the energy in OSTP, which is the coordination of the National Science and Technology Council. This is a cabinet level body that all departments and agencies that participate in. We're divided into a bunch of committees and subcommittees on almost any topic that you can think of in the S&T space. I have had the privilege of helping stand up the newest body under the NSTC, the Subcommittee on Resilience S&T. David Alexander down here is one of my agency co-chairs, as well as Mary Erickson from NOAA. And we're still in that forming and storming stage. We just started meeting in July. So we're still trying to figure out across this very diverse group of federal agencies, where can we make an impact in really advancing some of these S&T issues to build resilience? And where are we bringing in the partners? You all, the ecosystem. You stole my term, Ellen. But we feel very strongly that it's not just the people with a .gov address that have something to bring to bear. It's the .edus and the .org and the others that can really, we need to figure out how we work together. And so my role here this week is to listen and bear witness and learn and try to bring back with me ideas. I've already got a book full, so I'm really excited to be here, and I appreciate all of you sharing with me some of those ideas to bring back, so thank you.
Thank you very much to all four of you. Those were really wonderful remarks, and I think it's really important for us to take a moment to think about the unique opportunity we have here to have 4 senior executive service members to talk with us about these critically important issues. And I was taking a couple of notes, and I heard things like looking forward, strengthen communities, strengthen our resilience, concerns about the 40,000 communities who are wrestling with capacity building and capability and the availability of new kinds of resources. We talked about the importance of the local level, partnerships, making smart decisions now for the long view. I think both David and Ellen made this important point about having the long view, action now, but insight into the future. Local relationships, partnerships was talked about, ecosystems. I also loved the phrase being compelled to help. So I think these are really great phrases, really great ideas to kick us off into the conversation. And what I'd like to do is point directly to Maria, and then we'll kind of pick up on some of the points that you made already. And we had talked when we were preparing for the panel about some examples, some ideas. And so we talked about some of the federal investments and policy decisions being advanced to build a more resilient nation. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those ideas?
Certainly, I'd be pleased to. Actually, when I was given this sort of challenge of rack and stack the investments, I thought, well, it could be a whole session in and of itself. So, no, we won't do that. We have a movie to see, so I'll keep it short. In my role, I'm trying to look across the entire spectrum of what we're contributing, and so I like to think of the federal investments as fitting into a series or a continuum of functions. First, improving our understanding of hazards and threats, the impacts, the interdependencies, the cascading consequences, really a lot of the fundamental science and research that go into improving our understanding. The next is that where I have worked most of my career, as my former office director would say, that last mile between translating some of that basic science and turning it into knowledge and putting it in form and in ways and making it accessible to the folks that have to make those decisions. Then the last category I would say, major one, is projects. Things that we do to buy down the risk or reduce the vulnerabilities associated with a particular threat or hazard that you cannot avoid. And it can be things that are the brick and mortar, the projects, the concrete and the natural infrastructure in those dimensions. But then things like improving the capacity of state and local emergency managers, capacity building and training, coming from NOAA, a lot that we do to convene and build communities of practice to help peer-to-peer learning to solve challenges. So there's just this array of investments, and it's tough because a lot of the investments, particularly in that project category, end up being post-disaster. And I think we have the National Institute of Building Sciences and the Mitigation Save study. Dollar invested is at least, on average, a $6 return. well, where are we spending our money? Most of it is coming in after disaster. And so how do we develop policies and programs that can flip that dynamic? I think everyone is watching with bated breath as FEMA rolls out their new BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. Again, instead of having to hope for a congressional appropriation, they are now going to have funding that is tied to what we spend in disaster relief in the previous year, which I don't know what the number was, but if it was in effect in 2017, there's like $3 billion for pre-disaster mitigation. That's real money. So again, there are these opportunities where we're making investments across these categories. There's some other folks here that make investments that aren't on the stage. The National Science Foundation, and I think many of you here in the room probably know better the different pockets of money that they make available, including the RAPIDS program, where they make small pots of money available to go in and collect ephemeral data. These are critically important. We have these pieces and parts, and I think the big challenge and where I'm sitting in the role that I have as Assistant Director for Natural Disaster Resilience is trying to string these together more coherently and trying to help break down some of the silos. I feel, and I appreciated Cecilia's comments this morning about relationships. I see myself as trying to help promote connective tissue and working across different interagency groups. Some of them are hazard specific, but some of them are cross-topical, and trying to strengthen that connective tissue, because I think, yes, all of these investments and the projects and the capacity building are important, but the relationships are what have the payoff. And so I'm interested to hear, and I can let some of my other federal colleagues talk about their investments, but I think there's just some real opportunity. The one other thing that I would mention as an initiative that's happening through OSTP, we have a STEM director, and we have one of the initiatives I mentioned, Dr. Drogemeyer, is building the workforce of the future. And so I'm very heartened by some of the things that I'm hearing. I've been talking to them about how do we build resilience into the curriculum. And that the urban planners and the civil engineers, resilience is not a separate degree. It's infused into what we do. It's mainstream into what we do. And so how do we help promote that and support that in your sector? And so I'm, again, pulling ideas as we sit here and would love to hear more. You get my contact information. I love any ideas that others might have in that, whether it's work-based learning experiences, service learning. I've heard of 3 other different terms. I'm trying to get them straight. So I would appreciate your help as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, thank you. So just a quick note, if you are thinking about asking a question, I'll call you up in a couple of minutes, but we will make sure that we have time for some questions. So keep thinking about what you might ask this esteemed panel. And so I'm going to turn over now to David, if I may. Right, so David, one of the things you said to us is that we're still not prepared for everything, right? We can't be. But picking up off of Maria's comments about resilience, tell us what you think about the creation or how we instill a culture of resilience into our everyday lives.
Well, I think a little bit comes back to behavioral economics, and it's honing a better value proposition. And that was mentioned in a number of the sessions today, as well as this morning by several of the speakers. I think that's still a challenge that we have as a community. I think what I see promising here is that what we're experiencing is a convergence in urgency. And what I mean by that is the scientists are now thinking that they need to solve the problems today, and not thinking that they can take a long time and admire and conduct the research over decades. That matches very nicely with those that need to address the problems today, particularly those in the field. They're driven by the moment. So that's a significant opportunity that we're experiencing. We like to talk about convergence in technology, but I think we're seeing a convergence in urgency that is just as critical in how we start to hone that value proposition and change behavior going forward. I think what needs to be echoed in honing that value proposition is the significant spillover effects that are gained from targeted and focused investment in R&D to solve our nation's biggest challenges. The outputs of that focused, we may not be able to anticipate exactly what we produce, but what has been experienced over decades is that when we do make a concerted effort to channel R&D to solve one of our biggest problems, we make leaps and bounds, not in terms of just the technology and the products we produce, but in the economics and the benefits that come out of that targeted R&D. And I think that's an underappreciated value proposition that the public and key decision makers don't adequately understand. And I think by leveraging that convergence and urgency, we can start to bring those cultures together to articulate that, to get more traction. I think when, just to pair off of Maria, I think, FEMA and DHS, we have started with Congress's approval. The BRIC program is a prime example of how we plan to implement the Disaster Recovery Reform Act and Congress enabling set-asides through the disaster surge account for 6% to replenish that so that they're not just asking for appropriation every year. And how do we leverage new science to inform the rollout of that program? I think the other aspect of DHS is that we do have the Science and Technology Directorate. It is the research and development arm of the Homeland Security Enterprise. That's a key term there. I didn't say DHS, I said the Homeland Security Enterprise. In Congress's goodwill and probably prescience, they said, we don't want you to just support DHS as an agency because much of who DHS relies on is outside of DHS. We want you to support the Homeland Security Enterprise. And that goes back to we as a nation are only as strong as our weakest link. So being able to target and apply our research and development resources to things that will deliver not just directly to operating components, but benefit the operating components by empowering our external stakeholders are just as significant. Just last point. I also think that there are a lot of small things that we can do and we can message out, and I think the Mitigation Saves report is a good example of starting to show that not all mitigation and not all resilience investment has to be $1 million or more. It doesn't have to be a big price tag. There are small things that you as an individual can do, you as a business can do, and you as a community can do based on your funding appetite that can make just as much of an impact and difference on you as a community until you can gather and recruit and leverage co-funding to drive some of those bigger investments. And I think that also needs to be explained, and we need to do a better job of driving that message. And hence why I started the conversation with we need to have a little bit more research and effort put towards behavioral economics and driving change.
Great, thank you very, very much. I want to turn to the idea of the Homeland Security Enterprise and the idea of the integration between these federal programs and all the places that many of us are here representing, state, local, tribal, territorial governments, nonprofits, the private sector. So Joel, and I think Ellen as well, right? We wanted to talk about how are those federal programs being integrated that will kind of create the kind of resiliency that we're talking about, changing the culture through these kind of integration efforts.
So I always tell people that when I first became a federal employee, I have a t-shirt and it has a big red button in the middle of it, and it's called Duplication of Federal Effort. And if you push that button, you're going to send Ellen off into fits. Okay. So what I did was I started with this mission to try to understand what it is that each of our federal agencies is supposed to do, who our primary customers really are, how we serve the needs of our primary customers, and how we deliver that information from all of us. And so we started things like the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which was a White House effort that doesn't have a NOAA meatball on it, but it does have a lot of different federal agencies that were a part of that effort. It's a place where you can find a lot of our research and tools. Regionally, we also decided that we needed to start speaking. I think it was David that said we need to start speaking with one voice. And that is so hard to do. Everybody wants us to do it. We know that at the community scale. But we're trying to do that through these groups we call federal partnerships. And Joe's here that I work with in EPA Region 2. And we started a group, Joe and I did, on the Federal Partners for Climate Resilience, and that was for New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico, in EPA's Region 2. But then because my region goes all the way from Maine to Florida, I had to form 4 of these groups. So we have a New England Federal Partners group, we have a Region 2-ish group, we have one in the Southeast that's also led by Linda Reimer, EPA Region 4. And so all together, we are having the conversation across 16 different federal agencies at the regional scale on what we're hearing from communities, how we can work better together. So I would say that's our best effort so far. And not to mention, of course, the interagency groups that the White House leads, which cannot be denied, that we're working on things like improving the weather forecast across all research scales, improving our understanding of water, both falling from the ground and modeling it once it's on the ground. So lots of different integrated efforts happening at that interagency level too.
Great, thank you very much. Joel?
I would just echo what was just said and just add that you see this evolution and much better integration over, I'd say, the last decade or so, integration across federal agencies, both at the headquarters level, but also, and perhaps more importantly, at the regional level, as you were alluding to. We each have our own individual missions as defined by the Congress, and we have to work within those missions. But what we have discovered over time is we're all working within the same communities. And as we listen to the community decision makers, the stakeholders, we've heard loud and clear over the years, would you please speak, as you said, with one voice. We're overwhelmed with all these different federal agencies coming in, telling us what to do or what they can help us do, and so on. And over time, and it's a culture change for the federal agencies, we've done a much better job, and it's an ongoing process, to work together, to speak with one voice, to respect our respective missions. We at EPA, as Ellen has alluded to, we use a lot of the information that comes out of the Weather Service, comes out of other parts of NOAA to support our mission. We also work very hard not to duplicate efforts. It would be a waste of taxpayer dollars. And that's what's going on at the federal level. But again, at the regional level, and I'm just echoing what you said, the action occurs at the regional level, at the local level. And for example, we at EPA have 10 regional offices. You were kind enough to refer to my colleague Joe Siegel here. Joe, raise your hand. There he is. Kudos to Joe. He's one of our leaders on climate adaptation and the work we do in communities in Region 2, which includes New York and Puerto Rico. But again, at the regional level, as you've just heard, when we actually work with the communities on the ground, it's people like Joe and Ellen and others who are working together to speak with one voice, to leverage our resources, and to listen to the community decision makers to find out what their issues of concern are and to meet their needs. But again, I want to emphasize that universities can play a really important role. Number one, to facilitate that dialogue, and also to be a trusted voice. And I'll use the example of Alaska. When EPA goes up to Alaska, and I'm talking for Region 10, and we start to talk to them about the resources we can bring to them, or NOAA can bring to them, to help them with what they're trying to make happen on the ground, their eyes glaze over. But if you mention the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, they trust them. So we need to recognize that and work through that university partner together to make things happen on the ground.
Great. Thank you very much. Great. Do we have any questions for the panel from the floor?
My question is for Maria. You mentioned that one of the priority areas being focused on the preparation of the future workforce, but I wondered if you could speak to us about a future workforce that is reflective of the nation in terms of inclusion of historically underrepresented groups and so forth as you're thinking about that future workforce. Thank you.
So yes. No, and I mean, as a glib response, this is one area where I've been in my job now about 4 months, and so I'm still getting a bit of an education from our STEM and our Workforce of the Future folks. They have some initial priorities that they have been working on. There are a whole set of committees that exist under the NSTC that are focused around some of these issues. One of the big groups is this Joint Committee on the Research Environment and the swirl around that. And so I'm trying to, and what I have found is I have a job title that is resilience, but I don't own resilience. You know, it's something that is infused across the different things that we are doing. And so I need some ideas and I need some specific things to bring back to those conversations, because I think a lot of the things that they are doing, they're issue agnostic. They're just looking broadly at STEM education and some of these things, and resilience is something that I'm trying to force them to think about as a topic. But they seem receptive to that, and so now I need to follow. I have their interest. I need to follow with, well, what does that look like? And so I haven't gotten much past well, what are we building into the curriculum? What are we doing to ensure that we are reaching into communities that are bringing students that are reflective of those communities and giving them, and that's where a lot of these work-based learning opportunities have come up as an opportunity to draw in and show students careers of the future in creating those resilience professionals. So I don't have answers, I will just say that right now, but I am interested in your answers if you have some.
Great. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this? I see Ellen.
Yeah, I just want to mention that NOAA's Education Office is a huge resource for university communities and also for students. NOAA runs a hauling scholarship program that is for underrepresented college students to come and work at NOAA for, I think, a summer, and then they come up with a project at the end. We also have the Weather Service interns that come and work in the forecast offices, usually out of meteorological programs. I like to call it the Penn State Mafia, but I'm sure there are others that come from different universities. There's also the Sea Grant Fellowship Program. I also like to say I'm lucky to be a NOAA employee because I wasn't a Sea Grant Fellow, but most of them were. So there were Sea Grant Fellows that work both on the Hill and also in the executive branch that are spread out across not only NOAA offices, but other offices. They work at Park Service, they work at Department of Energy and others. So you can, other agencies can take advantage of the Sea Grant Fellows program. And then we also have been mentioning, I think, the on-the-ground training that happens, and Joel mentioned it in terms of how we do training on the ground, and that's something a little bit different. It's more like adult education. So that's really what I call the technical assistance. It's not about showing the tools that we have, but it's about showing people how to use the tools that we have, which is rolling up your sleeves and really using them. So that's a different kind of education. But there are lots of grants that come out through the NOAA Department of Education.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll take our next question. If you can just be sure to introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Cassandra Sheppard. I'm a professor at Bates College. I thank you for the panel. The last panel conversation that we were a part of talked about maybe if we could refine what it is that we mean, or define what it is that we mean when we say the word resilience. And like it's being put out there a lot, and I think that there might be some slippage between how people are using it. And I think it would be a good definition so that we could get like a good core, especially for working the rest of the weekend. So I wanted to ask you all what it is that you meant when you thought of, resilience. What do you define it as? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Can I take the first shot at it?
Please do. Please do.
It's a pet issue. Thank you for that question. I think it's critically important. Resilience means different things to different people. And I will simply focus on the question within the narrow bounds of climate adaptation and then turn it over to my colleagues. Speaking very openly, it's no secret, there are a lot of sensitivities around using the term climate change as we go out to different states, different communities. And over time, we've discovered that using the term resilience to extreme weather events, for example, to wildfires and so on, which we are in fact seeing occur more and more frequently, is a safer term to use than climate change. The problem is that we have not, as a community, always been careful as we've interacted with decision makers to clearly define what we mean as well as what they think we think they mean. For example, again, coming back to climate adaptation, when I talk about resilience to climate impacts, I'm not just talking about ensuring that our communities are resilient to more extreme hurricane events under current climate, but I'm also working with communities to think about how the frequency and intensity of those extreme events like hurricanes will increase over time. And it's important to make investments today to ensure we're resilient under future climatic conditions as well. The problem is, very often when we talk to mayors or county executives and we talk about resilience and we don't define what we mean, they're only thinking about investments to ensure resilience under current climatic conditions. So that's just one example where I'm just seconding your point that it's critically important in whatever issue we're focusing on to be very clear about what we mean and to understand what our stakeholders mean.
Great, thank you very much, Joel. I think because we're coming close to the end, we have 2 questions. If that's okay, we'll move on. And maybe what I could ask you each to do is introduce your question. So we'll take both questions, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. So if you would.
Hi, my name is Rebecca de Jesus Crespa, professor at LSU. I had the opportunity to be a postdoc with the EPA ORD, and I was surprised to learn about the amount of tools that there are available in EnviroAtlas, EPA H2O, Climate Resilience Index, Human Wellbeing Index, so many different indices that could be used by community leaders and academics that I wasn't aware of until I got to that position at EPA. And I think the use and transfer of those tools gets missed a lot, and then you just get an accumulation of tools and agencies having very similar tools developing at the same time. So I just wanted to comment on my experience and say that I think the validation on the ground of these tools is a great opportunity to leverage university collaborations with federal agencies.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just take the next question and then ask you to respond?
Oh, I thought you were going to do that.
Yeah. Could you give us your question, sir, or comment?
Yes, excuse me. My name is Jose Luis Rodriguez. I represent the Caribbean Preparedness and Response, which is a non-for-profit organization in Puerto Rico addressing the issue of communications. We have been working in the past year closely with the FCC as they announced that they were going to allocate about $800 million for about $1 million for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And we have been trying to expose the community approach as to how that funding could be used. Unfortunately, statutes have limited their ability, as they tell us, to be able to dedicate funds for this effort. They have invited us to continue the conversation to see if there could be an interagency approach to support what we're trying to do. And our effort is to try to provide centers with a platform that during an emergency, there will be in 1 hour after any disaster, communications with voice, data, and video. And when there is not a disaster, a platform for training and for distance learning. My question to you is, Maria mentioned that, I don't know if I heard correctly, that there will be a $3 billion pot for communications. No? Then I heard wrong. But I would like to hear from the panel, what can we, how can an organization like this be able to work with the federal agencies to make sure that a place like Puerto Rico that has very unique needs where technology, you have to consider the technology needs of the whole Caribbean, not only Puerto Rico, but satellite is a key component should be a key component in the toolkit of technologies, and was not going to be included in the commission. We were able to include it. That's a half of a success. But my question to you is this: how can we make sure that federal agencies understand that in rural areas that kids still have not access to internet 30 years after the E-rate, okay? And let alone in a disaster, how can we continue communicating to make sure that these agencies are responsive to those community needs? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to speak to this question or to the previous comment?
So I'm thinking about the second question, but I did want to address the first one. more an issue from the agency from whence I came at NOAA. We talk a lot about, within the Office for Coastal Management, about tool fatigue. That there has been this proliferation of well-intentioned, great tools. And we, can go out to stakeholders and ask them what they need. And we're starting to hear back, for the love of God, no more tools. Tell us how to use the tools that are out there. Show us which ones are appropriate in which contexts. I'm seeing a lot of people nodding in the room. Help us see signal through noise. And so one of the things that I know NOAA has been trying to do, and some of it is being regionally delivered, is doing that census of tools, not just NOAA tools, it's from the community, from the nonprofit sector. Nature Conservancy is one of the key partners. There's this proliferation of tools, trying to understand their application, their limitations, where they used, and here's some best practices. That's where we are right now, and maybe slow down a little bit on the tool development until we can kind of catch up a little bit. But I'm very sensitive to the woman from LSU and that observation. It's overwhelming, and it's no wonder that the communities struggle, particularly after disaster where everyone wants to come in and help. It's even an issue in fair skies.
Great, thank you. Joel, you look like you want to weigh in on this.
Absolutely, because this whole issue is transformative for EPA. An anecdote, which was which really changed the way EPA has been doing business. About 6 years ago, there was a meeting at a climate leadership conference out in California. Everybody attending from the counties all across California were very concerned about climate change. They were the good guys, as it were. We as federal agencies were parading our tools. We had a big session on tools, decision support tools that we had been developing and throwing over the transom. And I'll never forget, a county executive got up and he said, "Thank you all, this is great, but," quote, "we don't need any more stinking tools," unquote. He said, what we need, and exactly what you just said, what we need is the technical assistance to understand, of the hundreds of tools out there, which ones are the right ones for the issues of concern to us, where we live, and number two, we need the technical assistance to understand how to use the tools. I will simply say, that's when I came back to EPA. Administrator McCarthy was our administrator at the time, and I said, we have a problem. And long story short, that's what led to the development of the Adaptation Resource Center. Not just to be a portal to all the tools from EPA and other federal agencies, but also to lead the decision makers after they self-identify and tell us what are the issues of concern to them, where they lead, to lead them to the right tools to help them replicate successes other communities have had adapting to climate change.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to ask, remember folks, we got one more job, right? You got 30 seconds to tell me, to tell your colleagues here, what one action-oriented statement in terms of building a resilient nation, working together to build a more resilient nation. What action statement do you want to send this group away with? Who wants to go first? You got 30 seconds. Scott.
Act now or pay later.
Nicely said. Joel.
Action-oriented statement, echoing what I said before. You have an opportunity to step up to the plate and either working with Albany as they develop their Adaptation Resource Center for Puerto Rico and for New York, to work with them to support the development of that network, or to step up to the plate, accept the challenge, and develop a state-level version for your state in which you reside.
Ellen.
Do your homework. Know the NOAA people that are already on the ground. Go meet Sea Grant, go meet your RESAs, go meet your regional climate centers. They will point you to the tools that we already have out there.
Maria.
Get a leg up on what this network is trying to do by start making some connective tissue. Find 3 people that are not in your discipline. Go get to know them, exchange business cards, and commit to one thing that you will do a month from now, 2 months from now, that are making that connection. Just a small thing that you can do to start building the network.
Great, thank you very much. Please join me.